The year was 2387 by the Galactic Standard Calendar, when Admiral Kang Dae-ho stood on the bridge of his massive warship, looking at the dead solar system before him. The Sol system was nothing more than a dark patch of space surrounded by glowing energy barriers that stretched for millions of kilometers in every direction. These barriers were the pride of the Valorian Empire. They called them interdiction fields, and they made sure nothing could get in or out of human space. Kang Dae-ho had been patrolling this area for 3 years now. Every day was the same routine. Check the barriers. Scan for any signs of human activity. Report back to command that everything was quiet. The Empire had placed him here as punishment for asking too many questions about their war tactics. They said guarding the human quarantine zone was important work, but Dae-ho knew better. This was where they sent officers who thought too much. The humans had been locked away for 50 years now. 50 long years since they had dared to fight back against the mighty Valorian Empire. Most species in the galaxy surrendered within days when the Empire arrived at their worlds. They understood that resistance was pointless against such overwhelming power, but not the humans. They had actually fought back during what the Empire called the cleansing of their outer colonies. Dae-ho remembered the stories from the old veterans. The humans had used weapons that made no sense. They turned asteroids into missiles. They hid inside gas clouds and ambushed Imperial fleets. They even used their own damaged ships as bombs. It was chaos and madness and completely against every rule of civilized warfare. The Empire had won in the end, but the cost had been higher than anyone expected. So the decision was made to quarantine them instead of destroying them completely. Let them sit in their little solar system and think about what they had done. Let them slowly die out from isolation and despair. It was a mercy, really. The Empire could have glassed every planet in their system, but instead they chose to be kind. Deep in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, a small human ship moved silently through the floating rocks. The ship was called Defiance, and it was unlike anything the Empire had in their fleets. Where Imperial ships were massive and gleaming with smooth curves and bright lights, the Defiance looked like someone had built it from spare parts and scrap metal. Captain Lee. Minwoo sat in his command chair watching the sensor displays that showed him every movement of the Valorian patrol ships. His ship was completely invisible to their scanners thanks to technology the Empire did not even know existed. The Defiance used a combination of stealth plating and gravitational field manipulation that made it blend into the background. Radiation of space itself. Minwoo was 35 years old and had spent his entire adult life preparing for this moment. He had been born just 5 years before the quarantine began. He grew up in a world where every adult talked in whispers about the day they would break free from their prison. He learned to pilot ships by flying through asteroid fields that would destroy any normal vessel. He studied every recorded battle between humans and the Empire until he knew their tactics better than they did. Next to him sat his navigation officer, Park So-jin. She was younger than Minwoo by 2 years and had never seen anything beyond the Sol system. But she could plot a course through a meteor shower while under fire and never miss her target by more than a few meters. Her fingers danced across her control panel as she tracked the movement patterns of every Valorian ship in the area. At the weapons station, Kim Tae-young monitored the Empire patrol routes with the patience of a hunter. He had been born on Mars and had watched Imperial ships through telescopes since he was a child. Now he was the best gunner in the human fleet and could hit a target the size of a dinner plate from 1,000 kilometers away. His job today was not to shoot anything but to learn everything he could about Imperial weaknesses. The three of them represented something the Empire could never understand. They were the children of the quarantine. They had grown up knowing that every day of their lives was borrowed time until the Empire decided to finish what they had started. But instead of making them afraid, this knowledge had made them determined. They would not go quietly into the darkness. On his sensor display, Minwoo could see the massive form of Admiral Kang Dae-ho's flagship moving in its slow patrol pattern. The Imperial vessel was 10 times the size of the Defiance and carried enough firepower to destroy a small moon. But size and power were not everything in space combat. The Empire had never learned this lesson, and that would be their downfall. So-jin looked up from her navigation console and spoke quietly. The sensors are picking up increased chatter from the Imperial communication networks. Something has changed in their patrol schedules. They are moving to a new formation pattern. Minwoo nodded and made notes on his personal datapad. Every piece of information they gathered would be sent back to Earth, where teams of analysts would study it for weaknesses. The Empire thought the quarantine had cut humans off from the galaxy, but they were wrong. Humanity had spent 50 years learning everything they could about their captors. Tae Young turned from his weapons display with news. 3 new ships have joined the patrol fleet, heavy cruisers by the look of their energy signatures. The Empire is reinforcing the blockade. This was interesting news. Why would the Empire need more ships to watch over a supposedly dying human civilization? Unless they were not as confident in human weakness as they pretended to be. Minwoo smiled for the first time in days. Fear was something humans understood very well. It was a weapon that could be used against even the mightiest enemy. The captain made his decision. It was time to return to Earth and report what they had learned. The Defiance turned slowly and began moving deeper into the asteroid field, where the Empire's sensors could never follow. Soon they would reach the hidden base where other human ships waited in the shadows. The Empire believed they were watching over the slow death of the human race. They had no idea they were actually witnessing the preparation for humanity's return to the stars. High Commander Ryu Sang-min sat in his private chambers aboard the flagship Eternal Dominion, high above the Valorian homeworld. The walls around him were covered with star charts showing the 14 systems under Imperial control. Each system was marked with symbols showing their military strength and resource production. But his eyes always returned to one small section of the map, where a red warning symbol marked the quarantined Sol system. Sang-min was the greatest military mind the Empire had produced in 3 centuries. He had conquered 7 star systems personally and had never lost a single battle. The Emperor trusted him with the most important decisions about war and peace across the galaxy, but the humans still troubled his dreams 50 years after their defeat. On his desk lay the latest intelligence reports from the Sol system blockade. Admiral Kang Dae-ho sent the same report every month. No communications detected from Earth. No ships attempting to break the quarantine. No signs of advanced technology development. The energy readings from their homeworld showed a civilization slowly declining into primitive conditions. Sang-min picked up one report and read it again. The human population appeared to be shrinking. Their industrial output had dropped to almost nothing. Their space traffic was limited to short trips between their inner planets. Everything suggested a species that was giving up hope and waiting to die. This should have made him happy, but instead it made him nervous. Humans were not like other species. During their brief war with the Empire, they had shown a creativity and stubbornness that was completely alien to normal civilized behavior. They had used tactics that made no logical sense and had kept fighting even when victory was impossible. The High Commander stood up and walked to his window that looked out over the Imperial capital city below. Millions of beings from dozens of species lived and worked in perfect harmony under Valorian rule. They understood their place in the galactic order, and were grateful for the peace and prosperity the Empire provided. This was how civilization was supposed to work, but humans had rejected this gift. They had chosen chaos and violence over order and peace. Even now, after 50 years of isolation, they refused to send any messages asking for mercy or forgiveness. Their silence was either the sign of a broken people or the sign of something much more dangerous. Meanwhile, in a hidden facility deep beneath the surface of Earth, Dr. Choi Yoon-jung worked on technologies that would have seemed like magic to the Empire, watching from outside the quarantine. She was 58 years old and had spent the last 30 years of her life developing weapons and tools that could defeat the most advanced civilization in the galaxy. The Ser laboratory around her hummed with the sound of machines that bent the laws of physics in ways the Empire had never imagined. Gravity manipulation devices that could create artificial black holes or make massive objects weightless. Quantum communication systems that could send messages instantly across any distance without detection. Adaptive artificial intelligence that could learn and evolve faster than any biological mind. Yoon-jung paused in her work to look at the holographic display showing the current status of Project Liberation. 50 years of preparation were almost complete. Every human settlement from Mercury to Pluto was connected by a network of hidden bases and secret factories. Weapons and ships were being built in locations the Empire could never detect. An entire generation of soldiers and pilots had been trained for the war that was coming. The Empire thought they were watching the slow death of the human race. They had no idea they were actually witnessing the birth of something that could destroy them. In a training facility on the far side of the moon, Commander Yoon Han-nul led her squadron through their daily exercises. She was 31 years old and had been flying combat missions in simulators since she was 15. Her pilots were the best humanity had ever produced because they had to be. There would be no second chances when the war began. Hanul watched her pilots navigate through a simulated asteroid field while under fire from virtual enemy ships. They moved their vessels like dancers performing a deadly ballet. Each pilot knew exactly where every other pilot would be at any given moment. They had practiced together so many times that they could fight as a single organism with multiple bodies. The simulation ended with all enemy ships destroyed and all human vessels intact. This was the only acceptable outcome in any training exercise. Hanul had told her pilots many times that they were not just fighting for Earth, but for every human who had ever lived or ever would live. Failure was not just defeat, but the end of their entire species. After the training session, Hanul met with her squadron leaders to review the latest intelligence reports from the blockade patrols. Captain Lee Minwoo had returned with detailed scans of new Empire ships joining the quarantine fleet. The data would help them plan their attack routes and target priorities. One of her pilots asked the question they were all thinking. When would the attack begin? Hanul looked at each of them before answering. Soon, she said. Very soon. Back on his flagship, High Commander Ryu Sang-min received an urgent message from the Imperial Council. They wanted a full review of the human quarantine policy. Some members were questioning whether it was necessary to maintain such a large fleet, watching over a dying civilization. The resources could be better used expanding into new systems or strengthening defenses against other potential threats. Sang-min considered this request carefully. Part of him agreed that the humans were no longer a meaningful threat. But another part of him remembered the chaos of their original war, the unpredictable tactics and the absolute refusal to surrender, even when facing certain death. He decided to recommend maintaining the current quarantine strength for now. It was better to be cautious when dealing with a species that had already surprised them once. The Empire had waited 50 years to see the humans fade away. They could wait a little longer to be absolutely certain. This decision would prove to be both wise and completely inadequate for what was coming. The medical convoy from Earth was nothing more than 3 small ships carrying supplies to the Mars colonies when Admiral Kang Dae-ho received orders from High Command. The ships were broadcasting emergency signals about a plague outbreak affecting thousands of colonists. They needed antibiotics and medical equipment to prevent massive deaths. Dae-ho stood on his bridge reading the transmission from the human vessels. The message was simple and desperate. Please allow us passage to Mars. People are dying. We have medicine that can save them. We ask for mercy in the name of basic decency between civilized beings. The Admiral felt something twist in his stomach as he read those words. He had been a soldier for 25 years and had seen many terrible things during his service. But there was something about desperate people begging for help that still affected him. These were not warriors or rebels. They were doctors and nurses trying to save lives. He opened a communication channel to High Command and requested permission to allow the convoy through. The response came back within minutes, and it was exactly what he had feared it would be. Permission denied. The quarantine must be maintained at all costs. No exceptions for any reason. Dae-ho closed his eyes and tried to think of another solution. But his orders were clear, and the Empire did not tolerate disobedience. He opened fire on the medical convoy with his main weapons. The 3 human ships were destroyed in seconds. There were no survivors. The Admiral did not know that his actions had just guaranteed the destruction of the Valorian Empire. On Earth, the news of the medical convoy reached President Kim Jae-min within hours through the quantum communication network. He was a man who had spent his entire career trying to find peaceful solutions to problems. He had hoped that someday the Empire might be willing to negotiate an end to the quarantine. But the destruction of ships carrying medicine to dying civilians ended any possibility of peace. Jae-min called an emergency meeting of the Global Defense Council. Representatives from every human settlement gathered in the secure conference room, deep beneath the capital city. The president looked at each face around the table before speaking the words that would change everything. The quarantine ends now, he said. We have waited 50 years for the Empire to show mercy or wisdom. Today they showed us what they really are. We will not wait any longer. Admiral Jang Seok-ho had been preparing for this moment his entire life. He was the commander of Earth's hidden fleet and the architect of Operation Breakthrough. For decades, he had studied every possible way to escape the quarantine and strike back at the Empire. Now the time had finally come. His flagship was called Vengeance, and it was built with technology the Empire had never seen before. The hull was made from materials that could absorb energy weapons and redirect the power to its own systems. The engines used gravity manipulation to move faster than anything in the Imperial fleet. The weapons could punch through any known shield system. Siak-Ho gathered his fleet commanders in the briefing room aboard the Vengeance. 50 years of preparation had produced 200 ships of various sizes and capabilities. Each vessel was crewed by people who had trained their entire lives for this mission. They would either break through the blockade or die trying. There would be no surrender. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Human gravity well generators would collapse sections of the Valorian interdiction field from the inside. The moment the barriers fell, human ships would pour through the gaps like water through a broken dam. Speed and surprise would be their greatest weapons against the Empire's superior numbers. Captain Lee Minwoo received his orders while the Defiance was still hidden in the asteroid belt. His mission was to lead a squadron of stealth ships against the Valorian communication relays. Without their instantaneous communication network, the Imperial fleet would be deaf and blind. Each ship would have to fight alone without coordination or support. Minwoo looked at his crew as they prepared for combat. Park So-jin was already plotting attack vectors for 6 different relay stations. Kim Tae-young was checking and rechecking his weapons systems. Neither of them showed any fear or hesitation. They had been born for this moment. The attack began at exactly midnight Earth time. Deep space monitoring stations detected massive gravitational distortions throughout the Sol system, as human gravity well generators activated simultaneously. The Valorian interdiction fields began to collapse in multiple locations as the technology that maintained them was overwhelmed by forces it was never designed to handle. Admiral Kang Dae-ho was eating dinner in his quarters when the alarms began screaming throughout his ship. He rushed to the bridge to find his officers staring at sensor displays that showed impossible readings. The quarantine barriers were failing everywhere at once, and something was moving through the gaps. The first human ships to emerge were unlike anything in the Imperial database. They moved in ways that violated basic physics as Dae-ho understood them. They appeared on sensors for seconds before vanishing again as their stealth systems activated. When they fired their weapons, the energy signatures were completely unknown. Dae-ho tried to coordinate his fleet's response but discovered that his communication systems were being jammed by signals coming from multiple directions. His ships could not talk to each other or to high command. Each vessel was fighting alone against an enemy that seemed to appear and disappear at will. The human ships moved through space like hunting wolves. They would emerge from hiding to strike at Imperial vessels before vanishing again into the darkness. The Valorians found themselves shooting at shadows while real targets destroyed them from unexpected angles. Captain Lee Minwoo led his squadron against communication. Relay Station 7, the massive structure was protected by shield generators and defensive weapons that should have made it impregnable. But human weapons had been designed specifically to overcome Imperial defenses. The Defiance fired a gravity torpedo that collapsed the relay's shields by creating a localized black hole. Secondary explosions destroyed the communications equipment and left the station dark and silent. 5 more relays fell to similar attacks within the first hour of combat. As reports of the human breakout reached the Valorian homeworld, High Commander Ryu Sang-min realized that his worst fears were coming true. The supposedly dying humans had somehow developed capabilities that challenged everything the Empire thought they knew about warfare. The quarantine that was meant to contain humanity had instead given them time to prepare for revenge. High Commander Ryu Sang-min stood in the war room of his flagship, watching the holographic display that showed the disaster unfolding across 3 star systems. Red markers indicated human ships moving freely through space that had been under complete Imperial control for 50 years. Blue markers showed Valorian fleets trying desperately to contain an enemy they did not understand. The reports coming in from his fleet commanders made no sense according to everything Sang-min knew about warfare. Human ships were appearing inside his formations without warning. Imperial vessels were turning their weapons on their own allies. Entire squadrons were going silent without sending distress signals. It was chaos on a scale he had never imagined possible. Sang-min activated his emergency powers and began mobilizing the 5th and 7th fleets. These were the Empire's finest fighting forces with crews trained at the best military academies in the galaxy. Each fleet contained over 300 ships, including massive dreadnoughts that could destroy entire planets. Surely overwhelming firepower would crush this human uprising quickly. The High Commander sent orders to all fleet commanders: standard formation attacks, concentrate fire on single targets, use maximum force to break enemy resistance. These were the tactics that had conquered 14 star systems and brought peace to the galaxy. They had never failed before. But the humans did not fight like any enemy the Empire had faced before. Engineer Bay. Juncio worked frantically in the captured computer core of a Valorian heavy cruiser, while explosions shook the ship around him. His team of technical specialists had boarded the Imperial vessel during the confusion of battle. Now they were racing against time to complete their mission before the ship's crew could organize a counterattack. Juncio's fingers flew across alien control interfaces as he rewrote the ship's basic operating systems. The Valorian computer networks were incredibly sophisticated, but they were also standardized across their entire fleet. Once you understood how one Imperial ship worked, you could control any Imperial ship. The human engineer smiled as he finished uploading new command codes into the cruiser's weapons systems. The ship's guns turned away from human targets and began firing on other Valorian vessels. Confusion spread through the Imperial formation as ships that should have been allies suddenly became enemies. This was happening across dozens of battlefields throughout the outer systems. Human boarding parties were capturing Imperial ships faster than they could be replaced. Each captured vessel became another weapon turned against the Empire that had built it. Dr. Han Yu-jin monitored the deployment of her latest creation from the bridge of a human science vessel. The adaptive nanomines she had developed were invisible to Imperial sensors until they made contact with enemy ship hulls. Once attached, they began analyzing the molecular structure of Valorian shield generators and armor plating. Within minutes, each nanomine had learned everything it needed to know about Imperial defensive systems. They began broadcasting their discoveries to other mines throughout the battle zone. Soon thousands of tiny devices were working together to find weaknesses in technology the Empire had considered impenetrable. The results were devastating. Valorian shields began failing as the nanomines found frequency resonances that caused catastrophic feedback loops. Imperial armor plating dissolved as microscopic machines ate through molecular bonds that had never been broken by conventional weapons. Ships that had seemed invulnerable minutes earlier were suddenly helpless against human attack. Park So-jin had been promoted to captain of her own vessel after the success of the first breakout operation. Her ship was called Silent Thunder, and it was one of the fastest vessels in the human fleet. She had been given the most dangerous mission in the war so far. The planet Neptune, with its violent storms and crushing atmospheric pressure, had always been considered completely unsuitable for space combat. The electromagnetic chaos in its upper atmosphere could blind sensors and disable navigation systems. No sane military commander would try to fight a battle in such conditions, but humans had learned to thrive in environments that other species found impossible. So-jin led her squadron of 12 ships down into Neptune's storm systems, where they could hide from Imperial detection. The gas giant's natural electromagnetic interference would mask their approach until they were close enough to strike. The Valorian patrol fleet above Neptune never saw the attack coming. Human ships emerged from the planet's storm clouds like ghosts materializing from another dimension. Their weapons fired once before they disappeared back into the electromagnetic chaos below. 12 Imperial ships were destroyed before their commanders even realized they were under attack. So-jin repeated this tactic 6 times over the next 4 hours. Each time her squadron emerged from Neptune's storms to destroy a few more Imperial ships before vanishing again. The Valorian commanders knew they were being hunted, but they could not track enemies that moved through an environment their own ships could not. Survive in this pattern was being repeated throughout human space as Earth's forces used every advantage their home system could provide. Human ships hid in asteroid fields that would crush Imperial vessels. They used solar radiation to mask their energy signatures. They fought battles inside the rings of Saturn, where Imperial formation tactics became impossible to maintain. Admiral Kang Dae-ho found himself commanding a fleet that was falling apart around him. His ships were designed to fight in open space using coordinated tactics and overwhelming firepower. But the humans refused to meet him in fair battle. They struck from hiding and vanished before he could respond. They turned his own ships against him through methods he could not understand. They fought in places where his superior technology became a weakness rather than a strength. The Admiral sent increasingly desperate messages to High Command requesting new tactics and strategies. But Ryu Sang-min had no answers to give him. The Empire's military doctrine was based on principles that had worked for centuries. Face your enemy directly. Use superior numbers to overwhelm their defenses. Force them to surrender through displays of unstoppable power. None of these principles applied to an enemy that refused to be found or cornered or intimidated. As news of continued defeats reached the Valorian homeworld, panic began to spread through the Imperial government. The humans were not just breaking out of their quarantine, they were winning a war against the mightiest military force in the galaxy, and they were doing it by refusing to fight the way wars were supposed to be fought. The Imperial Council met in emergency session in the Great Crystal Chamber at the heart of the Valorian homeworld. 12 of the most powerful beings in the galaxy sat around a circular table that had witnessed the planning of countless conquests over 3 centuries of expansion. But today they faced something none of them had ever experienced before. They were losing a war. High Commander Ryu Sang-min stood before the council presenting battle reports that seemed impossible to believe. In just 6 weeks, human forces had captured or destroyed over 400 Imperial ships. 3 entire star systems had fallen under human control. Valorian colonies that had prospered for decades under Imperial rule were declaring independence and asking for human protection. The eldest council member spoke first, as was tradition. How is it possible that a primitive species we defeated 50 years ago has developed such capabilities? Where did they acquire technology that surpasses our own? What are we missing about their true nature? Sang-min had been asking himself the same questions every day since the war began. The only answer that made sense was also the most humiliating one to admit. The Empire had been completely wrong about human capabilities from the very beginning. Their isolation had not weakened them. It had given them time to become something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined possible. But the Council did not want to hear about Imperial failures or human ingenuity. They wanted solutions that would restore their dominance over the galaxy. The Emperor himself had demanded that this rebellion be crushed within the month, or there would be consequences for everyone responsible. Sang-min knew exactly what those consequences would be. The Empire did not tolerate failure from its military commanders. If he could not defeat the humans quickly, his career and probably his life would be over. Desperation made him propose the one option he had been hoping to avoid. Deploy the Eternal Glory, he told the Council. Send our ultimate weapon to Earth itself and end this war with a single decisive strike. The Eternal Glory was more than just a warship. It was a symbol of everything the Valorian Empire represented. The massive vessel was 15 kilometers long and carried enough firepower to destroy entire planets. It had been built to intimidate potential enemies into surrender without fighting. No civilization had ever continued to resist after seeing what the Eternal Glory could do to their homeworld. Admiral Oh Chang-wook was chosen to command the great ship on its mission to Earth. He was a career officer who had spent 40 years rising through the Imperial ranks by following orders without question and never showing mercy to enemies of the Empire. The Emperor trusted him to do whatever was necessary to restore Imperial authority over the galaxy. Chang-wook stood on the bridge of the Eternal Glory as it moved through hyperspace toward the Sol system. Around him, 2,000 crew members prepared for what should have been the easiest mission in Imperial history. They would arrive at Earth and demand immediate human surrender. If the humans refused, the planet would be reduced to radioactive ash within minutes. The Admiral felt confident about the mission because he understood something about warfare that the humans apparently did not. In the end, overwhelming force always defeated clever tactics and innovative technology. The Empire had built the Eternal Glory specifically for situations like this where lesser weapons had failed to achieve victory. But Commander Yoon Han-yul had been waiting her entire life for this moment. She sat in the briefing room of her command ship surrounded by 50 of the best pilots humanity had ever produced. Each person in the room had trained for decades to master skills that would be needed for the most audacious military operation in human history. They would not flee from the Eternal Glory like any sane military force would do. Instead, they were going to capture it. Han-yul activated the holographic display showing detailed plans of the Imperial dreadnought. Human intelligence had been gathering information about the ship for years, through captured databases and interrogated prisoners. They knew every corridor and every system on the massive vessel. They had studied the daily routines of its crew and identified weaknesses in its internal security. The plan was simple in concept, but almost impossible in execution. Human stealth ships would approach the Eternal Glory disguised as space debris. Small teams of soldiers and technicians would board the vessel through its waste disposal systems and maintenance shafts. Once inside, they would move through the ship like a virus spreading through a living organism. The key to success would be speed and coordination. The boarding teams would need to capture critical systems throughout the ship simultaneously, before the crew could organize effective resistance. If even one team failed in their mission, the entire operation would collapse and everyone involved would die. Hanul looked at each face around the table, knowing that many of these people would not survive the next few days, but she also knew that their sacrifice would mean freedom for every human in the galaxy. The Empire had made the mistake of bringing their ultimate weapon within reach of enemies, who had nothing left to lose. The Eternal Glory dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system exactly as Imperial tactical doctrine required. Admiral Chang Wook expected to find human ships fleeing in terror from his arrival. Instead, his sensors detected dozens of small vessels moving directly toward his position. Chang Wook was not concerned by this development. The humans were probably planning some kind of desperate suicide attack against his ship. They would discover that their weapons could not penetrate the Eternal Glory's shields or armor. Then he would demonstrate Imperial power by destroying Earth in front of their eyes. The human ships approached in a seemingly random pattern that made no tactical sense. Some moved in straight lines toward the dreadnought, while others followed curved paths that wasted time and energy. A few appeared to be damaged and drifting without power. Chang Wook ordered his gunners to destroy the closest vessels as an example to the others. But the human ships that looked like space debris were actually stealth vessels using advanced camouflage technology. As Imperial weapons destroyed obvious targets, the real boarding craft continued their approach invisible to Valorian sensors. Within hours, hundreds of human soldiers and technicians were moving through the maintenance tunnels and service corridors of the Eternal Glory. Hanul led the primary assault team toward the ship's main computer core, while other teams moved toward the engine room and weapons control centers. They encountered resistance from Imperial security forces, but the defenders were confused by attacks coming from multiple directions at once. Many crew members never realized their ship was being boarded until human soldiers appeared in sections that should have been completely secure. The battle for control of the Eternal Glory lasted 6 hours and ended with Admiral Chang Wook surrendering his ship to save the lives of his remaining crew. The Empire's ultimate weapon had become humanity's greatest prize. 6 months after the quarantine barriers first collapsed, the Valorian Empire existed only in history books and the memories of those who had lived under its rule. The Great Crystal Chamber, where the Imperial Council had met for 3 centuries, was now empty except for cleaning robots that maintained its surfaces, for no one who would ever return. Admiral Li Minwu stood in what had once been the throne room of the Valorian Emperor, looking out through massive windows at the city below. Millions of beings from dozens of species were learning to live without the rigid structure that had controlled their lives for generations. It was chaotic and sometimes difficult, but it was also free. Minwu had been promoted to admiral after leading the final assault on the Imperial homeworld. But he felt no satisfaction in the victory that had brought him here. Too many good people had died during the war, and too much had been destroyed that could never be rebuilt. The Empire's collapse had freed the galaxy, but it had also created problems that would take decades to solve. Behind him, the doors opened and former Admiral Kang Dae-ho entered the room. The Valorian officer had spent the last month in human custody, while Earth's leaders decided what to do with Imperial prisoners of war. Many humans wanted revenge for 50 years of quarantine and the deaths of innocent civilians. But Minwu had argued for a different approach. Dae-ho bowed formally in the Imperial manner before speaking. "I have come to accept your offer of service with the human fleet. My knowledge of Valorian military systems may be useful in maintaining peace throughout the former Imperial territories." Minwu nodded and gestured for the former enemy officer to join him at the window. The human admiral had studied Dae-ho's record during the war and found a man who had tried to minimize civilian casualties whenever possible. The destruction of the medical convoy had clearly troubled him deeply. Such men could be valuable allies in building a better future. The two officers stood in silence for several minutes, watching the city below adapt to its new reality. Finally, Deho spoke again. "Why did you spare us? Your forces could have destroyed every Imperial world, just as we would have destroyed Earth if given the chance. Instead, you offer cooperation and rebuilding. This is not how wars traditionally end." Min Wu considered the question carefully before answering. "Because we learned something during our 50 years of isolation that your empire never understood. Strength comes not from the ability to destroy your enemies, but from the wisdom to turn them into friends. We fought you to survive, but we defeated you to create something better." Dr. Choi. Eunjung worked in her new laboratory on the former Imperial homeworld, developing technologies that would benefit all species rather than just humanity. The gravitational manipulation systems that had collapsed the quarantine barriers were being adapted for peaceful construction projects. The adaptive artificial intelligence that had learned Imperial weaknesses was now being used to solve problems of hunger and disease throughout the galaxy. Eunjung had been offered the position of Chief Science Advisor to the new galactic cooperative that was replacing the Valorian Empire. Unlike the rigid Imperial structure that had controlled every aspect of member worlds, the cooperative was designed to allow each species to develop according to its own nature while working together for mutual benefit. The scientist paused in her research to review reports from former Imperial colonies. Some worlds had embraced the new system enthusiastically, while others struggled with the concept of self-governance after centuries of being told what to do. But progress was being made even in the most difficult cases as humans worked alongside local leaders to find solutions that respected both freedom and stability. Commander Yoon Hanul had accepted command of the Eternal Glory. After its capture during the final battle, the massive ship was being converted from a weapon of terror into a mobile humanitarian platform that could respond quickly to disasters anywhere in the galaxy. Its planet-killing weapons had been replaced with medical facilities and emergency supplies. Hanul stood on the bridge that had once been Admiral Chang Wook's command center, watching her mixed crew of humans and former Imperial personnel work together to coordinate relief efforts for a plague outbreak on a distant world. The same ship that had been built to destroy planets was now saving lives across multiple star systems. The irony was not lost on her that humanity's greatest victory had come not through destruction but through redemption. They had defeated the Empire by proving that cooperation was stronger than domination and that mercy was more powerful than fear. President Kim Jae-min addressed the first meeting of the Galactic Cooperative Assembly in the same crystal chamber where the Imperial Council had once planned conquests. Representatives from 47 worlds sat in a circle rather than the hierarchical arrangement the Empire had preferred. Each species had an equal voice in decisions that affected their future. Jae-min spoke about the lessons humanity had learned during their years of isolation. They had discovered that diversity was a source of strength rather than weakness, that different approaches to problems often led to better solutions than rigid conformity, that even the smallest species could contribute something valuable if given the opportunity. The president concluded his speech with words that would become the founding principle of the new galactic order. "We do not seek to rule over others or to impose our ways upon different worlds. We seek only to prove that cooperation and understanding can achieve what force and fear never could. The galaxy belongs to all who call it home." High Commander Ryu Sang-min had been offered a position as military advisor to the Cooperative Defense Force, but had declined to accept it. He spent his remaining years writing a comprehensive history of the war that had ended his civilization. The book became required reading at military academies throughout the galaxy as an example of how pride and rigid thinking could destroy even the mightiest empire. In his final chapter, Sang-min wrote the words that best explained humanity's victory over forces that should have been unstoppable. The Valorian Empire fell not because humans were stronger or smarter or more advanced than we were. It fell because we could not imagine that there might be a better way to organize civilized society than the one we had always known. Our greatest enemy was not human weapons or tactics. It was our own inability to learn and adapt and grow. The galaxy had learned that lesson now. From the ashes of the Valorian Empire rose something unprecedented in galactic history, a civilization based on cooperation rather than conquest, a society that celebrated differences instead of demanding conformity. A future where strength was measured not by the ability to destroy, but by the wisdom to create, and at the center of it all were the humans who had spent 50 years in isolation learning the most important lesson of all, that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from defeating your enemies, but from helping them become something better than they were before.